games case, the last word in the video games case is how strange the court's lineup was there, and what instruction, if any, it might provide you in writing your paper about the liar case. You've got an opinion for the court striking down the California law that makes it illegal to sell video games to minors, violent video games to minors. Scalia writing the opinion. Wouldn't be the most obvious choice, but look who joins him. This is really strange bedfellows. The three women, including Sotomayor and Kagan, those who pass for liberals on the court, and Ginsburg, sorry, all three of them, joined by Kennedy, who's normally the strongest justice on the court day in, day out over the years on First Amendment matters, forming a nucleus of 5 votes there, but they don't usually vote together. And look at the picture on the cover of the reader and look at the people. Well, the normal conservative-liberal split is right on party lines, determined by the political party of the president who appointed the justices, with the conservatives, Scalia, Alito, Roberts, and Thomas, joined by Kennedy, all Republican appointees. And, you know, if it's a 5-4 split along, and the case is in some way political, like Citizens United, those 5 conservatives are going to vote together, and the 4 so-called liberals would be on the other side. But here you got 3 liberals lined up with Scalia and Kennedy, and then Alito writing a concurring opinion, not dissenting, concurring, even though most of what he had to say was about his moral objections to the lessons that violent video games teach. But Alito, joined by Roberts, who didn't write anything at all, decided that the statute outlawing sale of video games to minors was unconstitutional, was a violation of the First Amendment, but for entirely different reasons from Scalia. That is, Alito and Roberts said this statute is vague and therefore unenforceable, unconstitutionally vague. A person of reasonable intelligence would have to guess at the meaning of what is outlawed. That's not an uncommon analysis in First Amendment cases, but it's rarely used, and even more rarely used, by conservative justices. Because you can always find some degree of vagueness. Our language is too imprecise to spell out every detail of how it might be applied in every circumstance. And then you've got dissenting, Thomas and Scalia, the brothers in the bond who are the originalists on the court, splitting up, Thomas dissenting from Scalia's opinion, and there's a little intramural quarrel between the two of them. Thomas taking the originalist approach and saying, well, the framers of the Constitution at the time it was written would never have understood that you can circumvent parental authority by speech that goes directly at minors. And Scalia responding, your history's all wrong, and even if it were right, what your point of view is would supplant parental authority, not supplement it. It would replace parental authority with government authority, saying you can't allow your children to have these games. And then Breyer, supposedly a liberal, always a little weak, a little wishy-washy, a little accommodationist on First Amendment matters, also dissenting, willing to give the state the benefit of the doubt on the studies that showed that there might be some minimal effect on the minds of the game players, the child game players. And what accounts for that split is clearly not partisan politics. They're all mixed up all over the place, and it's hard to figure out why. You see in the reader, my guess is that these hard First Amendment cases that aren't really political divide not along partisan political lines, but rather along the extent to which the justice has tolerance for unsettling, ugly, distasteful speech, and the extent to which the justice trusts the government to make good distinctions and good judgments about what's good for us and what's bad for us. A cynic might say, well, you can account for Scalia's vote by the fact that this is a business case. This is a pro-business effort. This is getting the government off the backs of the video game industry. Let free enterprise do what it wishes without government interference. In the same way that you might say that the Citizens United case was a pro-business decision all dressed up in First Amendment clothes. I don't think that's true in this case. I don't view this as a purely a pro-business effort on Scalia's part. Linda gave me a cartoon the other day showing Justice Scalia saying, this goes back to Citizens United, personhood begins at the moment of incorporation. Yeah, sure, he's pro-business, but I don't think that accounts for this. I think there are other factors that govern in these tricky First Amendment cases, like the liar case. Good luck on that. Good luck on your paper. All right, midterm. It's not my idea to have a midterm. It's not my idea to have grades. They tell me I got to do it, so I do it. It's the most distasteful. I love teaching. I love you. I love being with you every Tuesday and Thursday morning. But I hate rating. It's just something I don't want to do. And I've gone through all forms of testing over the years, from essays to true false to everything in between, oral exams. Every way there is, and there's no good way, there's no perfect way. And what we're going to do day after tomorrow is a little different from what I've done in the past. There will be 1 page of 4 short answer questions, where you've got about so much space to fill on the page to respond to the prompt, to the question. Answer the question. My advice is, answer the question. I can tell when you're bluffing, when you're blowing smoke. Answer the question. And then if you want to elaborate a little bit and demonstrate your mastery of the material, be my guest. Do that. But I want to see outlines or checklists and stuff that you've memorized. I want something that has sentences with subjects and verbs and objects, nicely spelled, no slashes. Good writing counts, really does. So that's 1 page, and then the next page looks like a multiple choice question in that it's got 4 options, but they aren't options. Each of the 4 statements is false. It may sound plausible to you, but let me tell you, it's no fooling, no trickery here. They're all false. And your job is to explain for each of them why they're false. which again gives you the opportunity to demonstrate your command of the material, and good writing counts. And then there will be 20 true-false questions. I know some people don't like true-false. Over the years, I found that it's a pretty good predictor, as good as any other technique, a pretty good predictor of how well you know the material. So that's what the test will look like. A couple of you have asked me, how do you study for this thing anyway? How do you study this material? My answer is I don't know. If I were doing it, one of the things, well, I suggested the other day, or I guess on BSpace, and we'll go through it today, that you go to the big questions, the questions to think about at the first page of each section of the reader, and make sure that you've got intelligent, informed answers for all of those. But another thing that you could do is just go to the table of contents of the reader and go down each item with your study group mate or mates and talk about what the point is of each of those things. You get to Morse versus Frederick. Well, what was that about? What did the court decide there? And make sure that you understand why. What was the outcome? You go down on each item. If you know all that, you know everything in the course. So let's look at the questions to think about for each section of the reader that we've covered so far. The first one, the introduction, doesn't have any questions, but I recommend that you do understand the features of the legal system that we went over at the beginning of the course, you know, what the common law is, and the other features of the system, and certainly have a grasp of Morse versus Frederick, the student speech case, the Longheads case. Then turning to the first section, which is basically Citizens United, these are not the kind of questions, by and large, that you're going to see on this test. These are normative questions. Should corporations have First Amendment rights? Well, you can come out either way on that and come to your own conclusions and arguments. And maybe your thinking will be influenced by what we discussed with regard to Citizens United, but maybe not. If corporations don't have First Amendment rights, the second question asks, what do you do about the New York Times and CBS News or any other corporate speaker? Do they not have First Amendment rights? If you've decided that corporations shouldn't have, how do you prevent the government from censoring completely corporate media, which is basically all media? Again, that's a normative type question. Should there be a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United? Well, it depends on how displeased you are, how worried you are about Citizens United and the takeover of our electoral process by big corporations feeding super PACs and so on. But then the fourth question is the kind of question that you might expect to see in the midterm. To what extent does the First Amendment protect political speech as opposed to individual speakers? And your understanding of that should be informed by the decision in Citizens United, where, as I read it, the main theme of Justice Kennedy's opinion for the court in Citizens United is that what the First Amendment protects is political speech, regardless of the identity, including the corporate identity, of the speaker. And government efforts to control political speech are highly suspect, content-based, must meet strict scrutiny, and so on. Then in the next section of the reader on subversive, symbolic, and protest speech, the first question is, are unpatriotic attacks on government policy protected by the First Amendment? And the answer is, of course, emphatically so. Yes, indeed. And we have a long history on that, starting from the reaction to the Sedition Act of 1798, the lessons learned from it, that government should not be allowed to quash attempts to attack government or government policies. Stromberg is it's the first case we talked about there, and it's an excellent example of First Amendment protection of unpatriotic attacks on government policy, where the court decided that the display of a red flag as a symbol of opposition to organized government, that's what it was about, a symbol of opposition to organized government, was constitutionally protected, saying that the law that made flying the flag illegal interfered with the right to criticize government and government policy. When does expressive conduct become protected speech? Well, a little hard to say. I mean, the notion is that in order to be protected as speech under the First Amendment, it's not necessary that words be uttered. That is, that conduct can be expressive, and I take it the kind of conduct that would be considered speech, expressive conduct, symbolic speech, is conduct that delivers a message. It's a way of communicating something, the speaker's message. And so the flag, flying the flag, is protected speech. In the homeless encampment case, the Clark case, putting up tents was, the court assumed, to be expressive conduct, treated as speech for First Amendment purposes. Then in what circumstances can government validly impose time, place, and manner restrictions on protected speech? That is, speech that is within the umbrella, underneath the umbrella of the First Amendment. Government can still regulate when something is said, where it's said, and how it's said. And that, again, the principal case that we considered there was Clark, the homeless encampment case, where the court laid out the test for when government can impose time, place, and manner restriction. Three-part test, that in order for the restriction to be reasonable and constitutional, one, can't be content-based. That is, the restriction can't be justified because of the content of the speech. It has to be content neutral. Second, the restriction has to be narrowly tailored to serve a significant government interest. Note that it's not a compelling government interest. This is a softer, easier test for the government to meet when it's merely regulating time, place, and manner of speech rather than the content of the speech itself. And the third factor that the court says must be considered is whether the restriction leaves open alternative channels of communication, other ways, other places, other times, other methods of getting the same message out to the public that the speaker wants to get out. Then in section 4, under disfavored speakers, to what extent must society tolerate speech that the great majority of citizens find offensive? From Let's get private restraint. What page is it on? What is it? Why did I skip it? When can the government order the press not to publish certain information? Everybody's got that hardwired, right? In what circumstances may government order somebody not to publish? It's the test from Pentagon Papers. The government has the heavy burden. There's a presumption against the validity of any prior restraint. That means that there's a heavy burden on the government to prove that if the speaker were allowed to go ahead, grave, immediate, irreparable harm to the national security or some other vital government interest would result. The exact same answer to the second question, when, if ever, does the First Amendment allow government censorship of information in advance of publication? Same answer. Recognizing that there are extraordinary circumstances in which the government might be able to get a prior restraint. That is, the rule disfavoring prior restraints doesn't say never. It says in extraordinary circumstances where the government can meet its heavy burden. Can WikiLeaks be successfully prosecuted for violation of the Espionage Act? Well, that's a bit of a guessing game because we don't know all the facts. And while the government still apparently has a grand jury working on Julian Assange, they've got to get him here to prosecute him, which doesn't seem too likely, at least not anytime soon. And the question would be, does he or WikiLeaks have a First Amendment defense against prosecution under the Espionage Act? And we talked about some of the weaknesses in the statute, some of the vagaries in the statute. It might be considered vague, using the same reasoning that Alito and Roberts used in the video games case, and would certainly require the government to make proof very similar to the kind of proof that's required to get a prior restraint. Yes, Roberts, thank you for your patience. How it could be constitutional? You sell our atomic secrets to an Iranian spy for $1 million. You're employed by the government and have a security clearance with access to the classified information, and you sell it to an Iranian spy for $1 million. That violates the Espionage Act. Right, but I'm thinking in terms of right. As the question is, does the publisher stand in different shoes than the spy? The answer is yes. Well, it may not be. I mean, of course, government transparency is not mandated by the Constitution. And you raise a serious question about whether WikiLeaks should be treated as a publisher, like the New York Times in the Pentagon Papers case, where all they did was publish information that they didn't lie, cheat, steal, or bribe to get. That was delivered to them on a silver platter. We don't know those facts. Sam, do you have something?
Oh, yeah, I was going to say that I don't really see that. That's hardly narrowly tailored. If WikiLeaks is selling the atomic secret, it's under the same statute. That's not very narrowly tailored.
Under the same statute as well?
I just think that example kind of proves that it's a very poorly written law.
Well, I agree that it's a poorly written law and it's confusing, and maybe the confusion is enough to create unconstitutional vagueness because you can't really tell when you violated the law. But it's not vague as applied to a spy who sells out, betrays our nation, sells some other nation. Okay, now can I go to section 4? To what extent must society tolerate speech that the great majority of citizens find offensive from extremely unpopular speakers? Well, for one thing, offensiveness is not a basis for restricting speech. That we know from, for example, the Jehovah's Witnesses case, where speech that is offensive to a majority of people does not thereby become unprotected speech. We saw that in the Jehovah's Witnesses case. We saw that in the funeral protest case, where the Baptist church picketers had these ugly homophobic messages that they were certainly offensive to the family of the dead soldier and so on. But the fact that you offend people by your speech is not a valid basis for restricting it, with at least one exception to that, and that's obscenity. I mean, the reason that obscenity is not protected speech, is in a category of unprotected speech, is not that it harms anybody. It's rather that it's offensive, deemed to be offensive to a civilized society. The second question is if their social value is outweighed by their social cost, can government deem certain